Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters, and Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, we make a start. So this is a part two, I suppose, of the Hadith and Sunnah discussion that we started, where I'd uploaded a video explaining the difference between Hadith and Sunnah. And we received some questions around that, and this video is about picking up those questions in a question and answer format. Just a quick introduction again. My name is Sitara. I work at the University of Leeds. I'm also a part-time researcher. I'm doing a PhD, and my topic of interest is, and my topic of research is riba or usury in Islam. I have with me today Fariha Anwar, who is a dear friend, also a fellow moderator on the group that we're running on Facebook called Reclaiming Islam, and this initiative is part of that. She's been receiving a set of questions from people as well. So I'll just start with asking Fariha to introduce herself before we go into our question and answer session. So over to you, Fariha.
Assalamu alaikum, Sitara. Thank you so much. As you know, and as most of the audience members know, that I am Fariha Anwar. I am one of the admins of Reclaiming Islam, and by profession, I am a program manager. This particular conversation, like you said, is going to be about the question and answers the question that we received regarding our topic Sunnah and Hadith. So Reclaiming Islam, I'll just briefly introduce Reclaiming Islam. It's an initiative that aims to introduce critical thinking, not really introduce, but it aims to rediscover a critical thinking approach towards the religion Islam and a more evidence-based understanding of the religion Islam. And we do this by digging into the Islamic tradition itself and by reforming many of our cultural beliefs that have dominated what we believe is the true spirit of Islam. So this is one of the major topics because this topic deals with what methodology we use to discuss issues and other matters when we discuss things on Reclaiming Islam.
Yeah. So that's really helpful, actually, Fariha, you mentioning what we're trying to set out to do. So what we're trying to set out to do is develop an approach where we have an approach where we create a safe space for people to ask questions of very important questions, which are very important to Muslims as believers. And sometimes such safe spaces are not available, and some questions are completely shunned, especially in traditionalist circles. So not only do we create that safe space, but also we don't give any kind of legal opinions. We're not a group that gives fatwas on anything. All we're doing is we're presenting evidence to our readers, and it's up to them to decide what they feel speaks to their heart, what they feel is closest to the Quran. In doing so, what we're also doing is we are always talking about the tools and techniques of understanding of Islam. So, we're introducing readers to terms like, jurisprudence or usulul fiqh, or, epistemology or sources of religion, because we want them to develop the tools and techniques which will help them become critical thinkers as well. So it's not just about giving knowledge to people, what Ziauddin Sadar would say, pouring knowledge into an empty vessel. It's about actually helping people empower themselves to try to understand religion and to engage with it so that it holds meaning for them and it seems relevant to them. So that's kind of where we are, and it's very much the start of a journey. So we do hope that in the long run we're able to make a difference and create a group of people who are able to take that journey forward. So shall we make a start then, Fariha? I think you have a list of questions with you.
Yeah. Let's start with the first question. This question has two parts actually. It says that if we have a doubt over the authentic hadith content, who are we doubting? The truthfulness of the narrators or the ones who compiled it? And the second part of this question asks that I understand hadiths are like pieces of a puzzle and they need to be viewed in context to be understood. But some authentic hadiths seem pretty straightforward and generic. So do we need a context for each and every hadith? So this is the first question.
Okay, thank you. So when I was reviewing the list of questions, I did try to take down some notes simply because I didn't want to miss out on important points. But and I will be brief and quick, but if there's anything that needs further clarification, Fariha, just ask. So in terms of the authenticity of hadith and who do we doubt, I mean, we don't need to blame anyone. Simply because if we develop a good understanding of the nature of the hadith material, then these things become easier for us. So the nature of the hadith material, as I've said earlier, is that of a historical archive. And so you need the skills of a historian to engage with that. And I'll give an example as well in a moment. In terms of the truthfulness of narrators, we know that the scholars of hadith have developed the ilm al-rijal, or the science of the names of narrators, in which they have checked the biographies of hundreds of narrators of hadith. And it is true that they have identified some narrators who they call kazib, or people who tell a lie. However, we can say quite safely that this body of knowledge, this science of critique of hadith is really very thorough. And so we can rely on that, on the understanding of earlier scholars around, who's a reliable narrator and who's not. This is just one way of analyzing hadith, by the way, to look at the chain of narrators. There's another approach, which is to look at the content of the hadith as well. But I think the question here is about narrators. So yes, it is possible that narrators can be not very truthful. Some hadith compilations deliberately include hadiths which can have a broken link, for example, or which are weak. So Abu Dawud will bring some hadiths which may have a broken link, what we call mursal hadiths. But then he wants to document the existence of that hadith, and he may put a note in there to say this hadith is classed as mursal. Sometimes what happens is people don't see the footnote and they just take the hadith out. And so that's what creates confusion. In terms of hadiths, which are, for example, a dua, a prayer from Prophet Muhammad in his own words, hadiths about cleanliness rituals, hadiths about moral issues. For example, if the Prophet says that somebody who looks after orphans will be very close to me in Jannah, this ties in with the morality of the Quran. So there is no need for us to go any further, because it makes sense, because we know from our knowledge of the Quran that people who feed orphans are people who are, and who do charity in general, are seen as very good Muslims and pious Muslims. So you don't sense a clash. And I think it's when you sense a clash that you need to do a bit more digging. So coming back to kind of the point about hadith being a bit of a puzzle and how they need to be viewed in context. So what I did was I asked my son, and he's doing English literature for his A-levels. So I asked him to bring me his Othello, which is here. And I asked him to dig out a paragraph for me. Okay, now I don't know anything about Othello, right? So he's dug out this paragraph for me. This is, I don't know which scene is it. So it's in, well, it says 1-371. So I'm assuming it's Act 1, Scene 3, something. So somebody will have to tell me how to interpret when there's a notation for a Shakespearean play. And Shakespeare is writing in the 16th century. So he's about 450 years before us. And the main character, Othello, says, "Most potent, grave, and reverend signors, my very noble and approved good masters, that I have taken away this old man's daughter, it is most true. True, I have married her, the very head and front of my offending." Okay. Now, if I ask you, Fariha, what do you understand from these few lines?
I had to strain to understand the meaning of this because it wasn't very obvious to me.
Yeah, but what was your...
Also, I've read this now.
You have read Othello before, so there is something in there about marrying somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I had to ask my son when he gave me this text, and I said, you have to explain to me what's happening. Okay, now the process here is very similar to what you would do with any historical text. And this is what you need to do with hadith as well. You need to understand the background of it, the context of it. So I can give you a bit more detail, okay? So the detail that my son has given me, and I'll say the same thing to you, is everyone in this play is white, everyone is wealthy, and everyone is Venetian. So they come from the, Italian city of Venice. Othello, the main character, is a black man. He used to be a slave, and he then became a general in the army. Okay. He then marries the daughter of a white man, and he's an aristocratic white man. Okay. His name is Brabantio, and Brabantio is part of this text here, by the way. So Brabantio's name comes up a bit further, just up from Othello's, statement I've read. So he's married Brabantio's daughter. And now aristocratic Venetian society can't believe the fact that a black man has married a white woman and that this white woman fell in love with him and married him. So they're coming up with all sorts of explanations. For example, he must have done some kind of magic on her, that she wasn't in her senses when she married him, okay? So they can't convince themselves as to why she would marry him. But what is Othello saying? He's saying that he's talking to the aristocracy and he's saying, my very noble and approved good masters, that I've taken away this old man's daughter. It is true that I've married her. And then he says the very head and front of my offending. Now, this line did not make sense to me at all. So I had to consult a footnote which said the highest or highest extent of my offending. In other words, this is my sin. This is my biggest sin, that I've married the daughter of a white man who fell in love with me. Okay, now that I've given you all of this background, those lines make a lot of sense. Okay.
Exactly.
So this is exactly what happens with hadith. Okay, so this is what Dr. Jonathan Brown was saying. If you look at his lecture where he talks about how to engage with hadith, he gives us the skills of a historian. You have to look at how the language is used, how something is described, the head and front of my offending. You know, in my words, it's the highest crime. You know, that's the easiest way for me to say it. What is the social context in which this is being said? What is the issue at hand? And until all of the pieces of that puzzle come together, it is very, very difficult to glean something meaningful from it. And this is the thing with hadith, okay? You have bits of an incident reported. You have partial reports from a partial commentary on a decision that went to court, or partial commentary on a legal decision or a punishment that the Prophet has given to somebody. Without knowing that in full, without gathering all the available historical evidence and all the other hadith reports on the matter, it is extremely difficult to come out with a ruling. And so you always need the skills of a historian who understands the linguistics, the social context, other reports on the matter. How does this tie in with the Quran and Sunnah? All of those skills are needed before we can make sense of hadith. Okay. So I hope that makes it clear. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. Just a quick question here. Mm-hmm. Has this not already been done by our scholars? If our scholars have derived some rulings or some policies or strategies from this hadith, have they not done this exact amount of research? Have they not gathered all the pieces of puzzle?
Yes, so scholars have done huge amounts of research. If you look at old sources, there are lots of discussions about what type of knowledge hadith is, how reliable is hadith as knowledge, what kind of rulings can we derive from hadith, what are the different categorizations of hadith, what hasn't happened, as of course in our times we have more advances in history and we tend to do things in quite a thematic fashion. So for now, given the amount of manuscripts and the historical journey that we've traveled, what we will do is we will go back and do things like, if there's a hadith that says that women can't be political leaders, let's look through all of the material on this and then come up with a particular viewpoint. Now, some of that happens because we have all of these libraries and the internet and various other sources available to be able to bring all that information together and do almost like a meta-analysis. But at the time the scholars are working on this material and when it is being formalized, yes, these discussions were happening around how reliable hadith is. And that's why you see various views on it. And some of these views I'll quote later when we talk about what is a mashhur hadith, what is mutawatir, and are hadith mutawatir, can we rely on them? Can we just rely on hadith alone as a source of law? All of those discussions were happening, and all of these issues and themes that I'm mentioning here, I'm teasing out, these have all been recognized by our traditional scholars right from the early centuries of Islam. So none of this is new.
The next question is by a reader who says that the technique of triangulation, she gives the reference of this technique of triangulation, where we use facts from various sources in order to authenticate something. Here she notes, and I quote, that the biggest glitch in it is if the sources that we are going through aren't independent themselves and are rather dependent on one another or seemingly reinforce one another. So how can we derive conclusions from those sources? So can this aspect be related to the issue of hadith as well?
So that's a really good question, actually. And in a way, we do, she's right, we do have to do quite a lot of triangulation. But it depends on what is being triangulated and how good the sources are, as she rightly points out. So for example, if you were to say something about the economy of Pakistan, and let's say you say that the GDP in the country grew by 10%, okay, you will always have to put a little footnote in there and say that the information has come from various sources. However, the overall economic information about Pakistan is not that reliable because most of the economy is undocumented. Okay, so the GDP may be an overestimate or an underestimate. So if your sources are not reliable, you have to just put a little footnote in it and say that they're not reliable. Now, in the case of hadith, it's a historical archive. It is a very well verified historical archive. But the moment we start seeing it as an independent source of law or deen, that is where the problem comes in, okay? So at that point, if we are going to derive any ruling from hadith, then we are going to triangulate it, in this case with Quran and Sunnah. And the Quran is an independent source of knowledge. For Muslims, it is absolutely the truth. The Sunnah is an independent source of knowledge, which is the normative practice of the Prophet, which is our deen, our rituals, our customs, our etiquettes, which the Ummah agrees on. For example, saying your prayer 5 times a day, okay? We know, without looking at any hadith book, that prayer is to be said 5 times a day, and that the Fajr prayer has got 2 rakah and Zohar prayer has got 4 rakah. There's no dispute on that. So those to become our independent sources, and then hadith needs to be triangulated with that. So this is actually the method that is discussed in the presentation and also articulated by Maulana Amin Ahsan Islahi as well. So I'm just going to very quickly read out a very quick excerpt from that. So this is a translation of his book Mubadi Tadabbur Hadith. So the translation is Fundamentals of Hadith Interpretation. It's been translated by Tariq Mahmood Hashmi. And what Amin Ahsan Islahi is saying is that the Sunnah is not based on ahadith, because hadith can either be true or false. The Sunnah, on the contrary, is based on the perpetual practice of the Ummah. All the Muslim generations from the Prophet to us have followed it without a break. The historicity of the Quran is established by its generality to generality transmission as the word of mouth. So the book was first transferred to the Prophet, then to the companions, and then to the successors. The Sunnah too has been transmitted through generality to generality by practical adherence of the entire generation in each successive layer. So in his words then, the corroboratory evidence for these practices found in major hadith books is an additional support for them. So because hadith is a historical archive, it will document the fact that Muslims say their prayers 5 times a day. And in that sense, hadith becomes an additional corroboratory evidence for the Sunnah of Namaz, which is already found in the Muslim community. Okay, so that's how he view it. But it's not the source, exactly, that's the distinction. One other thing to add very quickly is that Sunnah goes back to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, because the Quran tells us, I believe it's the 16th chapter, in which Allah says, I think, let me see, 16th chapter, verse 123, in which Allah says that you are to follow, you are the millat of Ibrahim, millata Ibrahim, 16:123, that then we reveal to you to follow the religion of Abraham, who was truly devoted and was not among the polytheists. So we are on the Sunnah of Ibrahim alayhi salam. So it's Ibrahim alayhi salam who did the Hajj. We know that he built the Kaaba. Ibrahim alayhi salam was saying the prayer. He would do he would give charity. So all of these things actually come from him. This is why in the entire Abrahamic tradition, in Christianity and Judaism, you find forms of prayer. You find fasting. Okay, that's why the Quran says that fasting was made incumbent on you, as it was to prior generations. But then it doesn't go into any details of fasting, because people already know what fasting is. Because the Arabs are Bani Ismail, they're the descendants of Ibrahim alayhi salam. They know that this thing called fasting exists. So the Quran does not go into that detail. So Sunnah actually predates the revelation of the Quran. That's why the Quran only briefly mentions it and doesn't go into detail. So it's knowledge that already exists in the early Arab community of the time. Okay.
So the next set of questions have been extracted from a long post by another reader on our Facebook group, who was responding to our original video on Hadith and Sunnah. So the first question that she asked was that Sayyid Sulman Nadwi differentiates between Sunnah and Hadith, because this is the reference that we gave in our first video. She asked that, does this mean he is implying that Hadith is not a reliable source of deen? Also, is he the only scholar who has said this?
So Sulaiman Nadwi is not alone in saying that Hadith is not a reliable source of knowledge. Okay, it needs to be verified. Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim are doing exactly the same. They're verifying Hadith and they're telling us this one is trustworthy. Yeah, that's exactly what they're doing. We've also discussed that hadith is not a source of deen. Okay, when you say source, then it means your religion comes from that. And we're saying that religion does not come from that. Now, the reason why we cited Sulaiman Nadwi was because his article is very comprehensive and very balanced. So not only does he differentiate between hadith and sunnah, he also explains the value of both of them. So he tells us exactly what the value of hadith is, and he tells us exactly what the value of sunnah is, but that they are two different things. So the other thing he says to us quite clearly is that Sunnah is the practical implementation of the Quran. So if the Quran is saying that obey Allah and obey the Prophet, Or if the Quran is saying in Surah Azab that the Prophet's practice is the best exemplar, so Allah is saying to us, his Uswa Hasana is the best exemplar. And then Allah says to us that he has completed the religion of Islam for us. Then we can put those things together and say, yes, whatever the Prophet did in his lifetime, whatever he did, it completed the religion of Islam. We can't then possibly be looking for sources of Islam 1.5 or 2 centuries later. Okay, whatever was Islam, the Quran and the way of being Muslim, the lived practice had already been clarified. And this is the reason why it's very important to understand why we can't see Hadith as a source of religion. Okay, so these are the points that Sayyid Sulaiman Nadwi makes. It's a really good essay he's written, and that's why we recommended it, simply because it gives a really nice overview of the matter.
Okay. So the next question is by the same reader. She gave us a link of an article written by retired Justice Mufti Taqi Usmani with a comment that his knowledge and authority is unquestionable, and hence she was quoting him. So Mufti Taqi has proposed 4 ways in which Sunnah was preserved: through practice, through discussions, through memorization, and through writing. So the last one of this is what we are calling Hadith on our forum. But all 4 sources are equally valid and authentic, and that we have chosen to call Sunnah is just the first of these sources. So she's basically asking why are we calling Sunnah only, because Mufti Taqi has said that Sunnah can be preserved in 4 different ways. So why we're only considering one of those 4 ways, and we are kind of dismissing the 4th way, which is preservation through writing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so remember we're talking about sources here. So the source of deen for us is the person of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, we get 2 things from him. As I said in the diagram in my presentation, we get the Quran from him, and we get his example, which shows how the Quran is to be lived, right? Okay, now this practice is happening regardless of whether somebody's writing about the practice or not. And I think that's the distinction that people often don't make, that something is being done and then somebody is writing about what is being done. That's the difference between the 2 things. Okay, so Hadith has some writing, not all of it, some writing. It has some content about what is being done, how the community is living. Okay, so Hadith will include information about Sunnah, and sometimes it does include contradictory information about it as well. Okay, so we're not saying that Hadith has nothing to say about Sunnah. What we're saying is that it's not the source. The point here for me, quite crucially, was about validity and authenticity. I mean, the reader is saying all 4 sources are equally valid, but valid for what? That was the first question in my head. If we say that Hadith is a valid source for us to learn about the history of the early Muslim community, the example of the Prophet, details about Islamic morality, partial reports about implementation of the law, yes, it is valid for that. Okay, but it is not valid as an independent source of deen or as an independent source of law. The moment we give that, we start considering Hadith a source, immediately we have an issue then with that. How does it match with the Quran and Sunnah? Because we do know that Hadith has things in it which contradict the Quran. There are things in Hadith which contradict the overall moral framework of the Quran. Okay, we know that a lot of problem statements actually originate from Hadith. Again, I'm not saying Hadith is the problem, it's how we have misplaced it. So the moment you take it out from its place, which I think the rightful place is that historical archive with lots of really important information for us to contextualize how we understand deen and how we understand law and how we implement it. But we pull it from that and make it an independent source, we have an issue. Because then I would be saying, my next question from the validity one would be, well, then it's not authentic. We know that. We know that efforts have been made to sift out the authentic from the inauthentic, okay? So this is why Hadith then needs critique and verification. And that's something that eminent scholars have been doing for centuries. You have to identify the authentic from the dubious. So it is incorrect to say that Hadith and Sunnah sit at the same level of authenticity. We cannot say that Hadith and Quran sit at the same level of authenticity. I mean, I have come across some really alarming statements sometimes where people say, well, Hadith is also Wahi, isn't it? Well, no, it isn't. Hadith is not Wahi. It may have information about Wahi, but Hadith is not Wahi. But when we say things like that, we start equating those sources of knowledge, okay, in terms of their authenticity. And that is really problematic. It's not something that our classical scholars have ever done. They have always seen Hadith as a source of information that needs verification. And there have always been discussions about what kind of rulings can you derive from Hadith. In other words, what is it valid for? Okay, so it's quite a nuanced discussion.
Okay, So the next question, as you mentioned in your first video, Sataraji, that hadith is khabre wahid. So the question is, why are you assuming that hadith is khabre wahid when it also has other classifications such as mutawatir hadith and mashhur hadith?
Okay, so this is a really interesting question because I kept thinking that I'd read a really, really good piece of research about this, and then I couldn't find it. And then this morning, Alhamdulillah, I did find it. So, so I can answer in a bit more technical detail than I would otherwise have done. When you say khabar wahid, what you're referring to are incidents that are reported from one or two people, maybe three people. It could be that there is just one narrator of an incident. Okay, it could be that it's an isolated report. So that's khabar wahid, means kind of a single isolated piece of news. When you say mutawatir, it means that the same thing in the same words. And by the way, our jurists used to use the word tawatur lafsi, or identical wording. So not only is the hadith being reported through multiple channels, but the wording of the hadith is also identical. That's tawatur, okay? Lots of people reporting it, and lots of people reporting it in the same way with the same words. Then you have the category mashhur, which basically just means hadith becoming popular. So it could be that the hadith itself has been narrated by one person, but it's become very popular in the community, so lots of people know about it. Okay, so that's the difference between the two things. Now, the reason why I'd made that statement was because I had read a really thorough piece of research, and there are other scholars who agree with this, so this isn't an isolated view, is that the authenticity of hadith is actually a pseudo problem. It's a fake problem, okay? In the sense that there are very, very few hadiths that actually reach the level of tawatur. Think about tawatur as saying namaz again. You know, millions of Muslims across the world say the namaz. The tawatur is so regular, so frequent that you can't doubt the authenticity of it. The fact that we have to say 5 namaz in a day in a certain way. The method of namaz is also transmitted through tawatur, okay? Hadith never reaches that. So you have to be careful about what you understand by the word tawatur. And so classical scholars would give different definitions. Somebody would say, if 3 people reported, it's tawatur. Somebody else would say, if 50 people reported, it's tawatur. Somebody else would say, if 300 people report, then it's tawatur. So scholars disagreed about how many narrators were needed for a hadith to reach tawatur. The other issue was that the category of ahad, or single report, was defined in comparison with tawatur. So what was not tawatur was ahad, okay? So then you have to think about, well, what does tawatur actually mean? And so while Halak has written a paper on this, what he calls the authenticity of prophetic hadith, a pseudo problem, it appears in a journal in 1999. It's quite a technical paper. If somebody is research minded and they want to go through it, I would highly recommend it. I'm just going to tease out the conclusions from that, okay? Firstly, that hadith scholars themselves only pretty much concern themselves with khabar wahid. So almost all of your hadith scholars, the traditionists, the people who were the muhaddiseen, concerned themselves with khabar wahid. Why? Because khabar wahid made up 99% of the material. Okay, mutawatir hadiths were very rare. Secondly, by 5th century of Islam, even the status of Sahih Hadith was causing controversy. Now, there are discussions, and while Halak gives us these discussions, between a scholar, Ibn Salah, and Imam Nawawi also writes about the two Sahihin, Bukhari and Muslim, about what type of knowledge they offer. You know, can the Sahihin give us certain knowledge or not? Is it reliable knowledge or not? Now, Ibn Salah says that they give a certain knowledge just because the community thinks that they're reliable. Yeah. But then his view is contradicted by a 13th century scholar, very eminent Maliki scholar, Ibn Abd Salam, who says that actually his view is defective. He uses the word raddi. Raddi is a jurist term for saying this view is defective. Okay, so you can see that scholars are not agreed on this. Now, Ibn Jawzi, in the 6th century of Islam, he tries to look for mutawatir hadith. Okay, and you know how many he finds? He finds 6. 6. And there are hundreds and thousands of hadiths, okay? He finds 6 that reach tawatur according to the definition of scholars. Now, when Ibn Salah himself, who's the 7th century scholar, who acknowledges that mutawatir hadiths are rare, when he starts looking for mutawatir hadiths, he finds one report which reaches tawatur, okay? And this gets even more interesting. This is the only report which has been narrated by more than 100 companions of the Prophet. And the report is this: he who intentionally lies concerning something I, the Prophet, have said, will gain a seat in hellfire. Now, this is the same hadith that I quoted in my presentation, where I said that Sahaba were reluctant to narrate hadith because even inadvertently, they did not want to attach something to the Prophet which may not be truthful. And this view is the only view from hadith that finds tawatur. So there are more than 100 companions who are saying, he who intentionally lies concerning something I've said will gain a seat in hellfire. Okay, this is the only hadith that finds tawatur. Now, there is one other hadith that comes close to it in Ibn Salah's own analysis, and that is the one which we all know, that actions are judged by intentions. Your niyyah, yeah, your amal are judged by your intentions, your niyyah. These are the only two hadiths, okay? Now, the maximum number that has ever been given for hadiths that reach tawatur is 9 reports. Now, because the content of these reports, then it's only 9 reports, is so small, our muhaddithin have never bothered working with these reports. They've always worked with khabre wahid, okay? That is the reason why I'd made the statement that if you look at something, you look at the nature of an archival material, okay? So when we look at Shakespeare's Othello, what is the nature of that material? It is a play, yeah? It's a play, it's a dramatic play, okay? Shakespeare is a playwright. What is hadith? As a body of knowledge, it is khabre wahid. Hadith is a collection of khabre wahid. So the idea of mutawatir hadith is a red herring. It's a completely misleading opinion, and it is often given by scholars who are ideologically wedded to this idea that hadith is an independent source of law. Yeah, that hadith on its own can be used to extract law from. Okay, so this comes from the scholar's own view of what hadith is, and it's not borne out by if you go into history. So in a nutshell, basically, there are no mutawatir hadiths apart from the couple of hadiths that I've mentioned. So that is why I said that hadith as a body of knowledge is khabri wahid. In a way, this is an agreed upon opinion amongst Muslim scholars.
The next question is kind of an extension to this one, because it states that you have used a Sahih hadith in your talk about the companions being aware not to attribute a lie about the Prophet. Wouldn't this be enough to strike fear in the hearts of the pure and pious companions? Can't you imagine how careful they must have been in narrating and writing down the true words of the Prophet? So the point basically is the same, that why are we doubting hadith when we know that the companions must have been extra cautious about attributing anything to the Prophet?
Yeah. Well, the answer is then they would have written it, and they didn't. Okay. So the companions did not write hadith down. The Prophet never initiated this practice. The Prophet asked the companions to write the Quran down, but he never asked the companions to write the hadith down. So if anyone was writing hadith, it was because of their own initiative to write. Now, I did say in my presentation that in the early centuries of Islam, there were a couple of manuscripts floating about, which can be called hadith manuscripts. Okay, one was a sahifa on how zakat is implemented. Another one was about diyat, blood money. And these were basically more administrative in nature. So they were like records kept. So when Muslim lands were expanding, you wanted to make your public administration decisions in a consistent manner. But we didn't have anything else in the early centuries of Islam. It is only later on when people do start saying things like, because remember, the community is trying to preserve the memory of the Prophet. Okay, it's natural. He's a great person. We want to preserve his memory. So more and more people are saying things like, I heard from so-and-so, and he heard from so-and-so, and he heard from the Prophet. Okay, when this process is happening, our scholars say, and because when this attribution is happening, people are also attributing things to the Prophet that he hasn't said. Okay, and we know that people have fabricated or made up hadith as well. And that is precisely the reason why then in the 2nd century of Islam, we see scholars emerging who are very pious, conscientious people. And they're saying, look, all of this information is proliferating. Let's write it down. So the actual transfer from an oral to a written tradition actually happens in that second half of the 2nd century. So that's the point I was trying to make. The second thing is that the companions were so keen to memorize the Quran, to teach the Quran, to propagate the Quran. The companions were so keen to copy the Sunnah of the Prophet, to teach others how to pray, to teach others how to fast. And yet they weren't actively writing hadith. Okay, so that's the point I was trying to make by saying that hadith as a body of knowledge and as a source of deen didn't exist in that formalized sense in the first couple of centuries of Islam. And in any case, if we say, going back to the point that deen has been completed, well, if deen had been completed then, why wasn't the need felt to be jotting down hadith? Because that should have been done to complete the deen. Okay, but the Quran tells us in the lifetime of the Prophet that the deen had been completed. So whatever was Islam had been understood and propagated as Islam by the wider community.
Okay. The next question is very much linked to what you just said. It says your claim that the writing down of hadith only started in the late 2nd or the 3rd century of Islam is baseless. Because Mufti Taqi Usmani says that the Sahaba were told not to write down the hadith only during the time when Quran was being revealed, so as not to confuse between the two. Actually, Islamati, this is also something that we studied in our Islamiyat class in high school. We were told specifically that after the Quran was revealed, Prophet himself asked the people to write down everything that they hear from him. So we were told that the work about documenting hadith started during the lifetime of the Prophet.
Okay, so
will,
yeah. Sorry, I've interrupted you. Go on.
No, I'm done. So what does your knowledge of you say about this?
So I think we have to be quite careful and precise about what we say in this matter. The point I made earlier was that I did say some manuscripts existed. Why? Because some companions of the Prophet, and certainly some successors of the companions of the Prophet, did not want to lose some of the learning they were getting from the Prophet. So if he made decisions about zakat, for example, he made decisions about how war booty is to be distributed, if he made decisions about blood money, okay, how those disputes are settled, people wanted to write them down for administrative purposes. But that does not mean that the Prophet initiated the practice himself or said, now I'm saying this, you write this down. If he had said this, we would have got hadith from lots and lots of different people. It wouldn't be Khabre Wahid. So something happens in a mosque, in Masjid Nabawi, okay? And there are 100 people or 200 people gathered in the mosque, and something happens, and the Prophet says, document it and write it down. I would expect that we would get reports from 200 people, but we don't. Why is it that we get reports from one person who says? So it's very natural. It's the kind of thing you would say, I recall that I heard from my aunt who heard from so-and-so. Or I recall that Fatima Jinnah, the sister of the founder of Pakistan, said this about Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And I know Fatima because my grandmother was friends with her. It is that process, it's that latter process that's happening, okay? So the Prophet is not saying, write my hadith down. Equally, if some of the companions say to him, I want to jot down what you've said, he might say, yes, jot it down if you want to. But he explicitly, at the time the Quran is being revealed, he explicitly said, do not write anything else down, because when the Quran is being revealed, the Rasul is giving the guidance directly from God. He's explaining it, he's living it out in the community, and he does not want any confusion between that. I mean, one of the examples of that is, when people in Medina asked him about grafting some date palm trees. And the Prophet said, yeah, go ahead and graft. And then the crop failed the next year, and people said to him, you told us to do this and our crop has failed. And he said, look, I'm a messenger of God, but I'm also a man. So there are things that I say as a man, but you don't have to agree with them. So how do you distinguish between what he's saying as a prophet of God and what he's saying as a man? The risk here is, if you start writing everything down, there are lots of things that he did as a human being, which did not have to do with what his station was as a Rasul. And so if anybody willingly jots something down because they want to remember what the Prophet said, this is fine, but that does not make it a source of deen. It just says that somebody exercised the initiative to memorize the words of the Prophet and then to write them down. So we have to keep that distinction in mind about, has the Prophet initiated that practice? If this were a source of deen, and if this were a repository of deen, then he would have said, write it down, because he wouldn't want that knowledge to be lost. But he never, ever initiated that practice himself.
The next question is, you have only highlighted minor issues in your presentation, such as the using the miswak and wind driving, but hadith has been used as an authentic source to drive many Sharia laws and obligations, such as riba and parda, wheeling. What is the status of these rulings?
Okay, so in my presentation, I deliberately used slightly smaller examples because I didn't want it to be too controversial. Having said that, the women driving thing is actually not that small. We have seen the injustices that have resulted from a misuse of that hadith. We know that women are not allowed to travel for study, for work. Often people cite that hadith, so it has had some serious consequences. Now, the issue that I was trying to demonstrate at that point in my presentation is what happens when you use hadith as a source of law. Okay, now the reader has given us examples of riba, they've given us the examples of parda. We know that, and these are lengthy discussions, so I'm not going to go into much detail here, but we know that errors have been made in how we've understood parda. We know that women have been confined to their house because of how we've understood parda. Now, it's interesting that even scholars who do, like Maulana Maududi, who do say that, there's a difference between hadith and sunnah, he recognizes that. But his legal method, when he's writing the book on parda, is that he does bring zaif or weak hadith into his analysis, because for him, for his legal method, he's fine with that. Okay, so precisely because of the use of hadith as an independent source, when we say this comes from hadith, therefore it is law, what you do is then you start changing the meaning of the Quran, the kind of the what is the general and the specific in the Quran, that starts shifting. So in riba, if you look at riba or if you look at parda, in both cases, the remit of the Quranic ruling has been extended. Okay, so in the case of riba, the Quran talks about riba, what is called riba al-jahiliya, okay, usury of the time of the Prophet. But hadith, if you look at hadith reports, and I have up until this point gone through 4 hadith books, Bukhari, Muslim, Muwatta Imam Malik, and Sunan Abu Dawud. And it is astonishing that in all those 4 hadith reports, hadith books, you do not find a single report about the riba al-jahiliya, which is the riba of the Quran. Okay, you find a different riba in them. Now, if you find a different riba in them, then the question in my head is, can I use hadith to extend the remit of the riba ruling in the Quran? Okay, so the moment you start using hadith as law, these discussions suddenly become quite relevant and quite complicated. It would be the same with veiling, with parda. Where does this idea of a woman covering her face come from? It's not in the Quran. The word parda is not mentioned in the Quran. The word hijab is not mentioned in the Quran to refer to veiling. So where has this come from? So actually, I'm glad they've given us these examples, because these examples show what happens when you start taking hadith as an independent source of law. It shifts your understanding of what the Quran is saying. So in the case of riba, this whole category of riba al-fadl, or riba of excess, has come up. In terms of practical implementation, there isn't much. It has led to huge juristic debates. And all of those juristic debates, really, sometimes people say, yes, they're meaningful. And sometimes other scholars like Maulana Maududi would say, well, this isn't riba, and it's not the riba about which there's such a strict punishment that Allah declares war on those who take riba. It's not that riba, but it's a riba, the riba of hadith is a riba that can lead to that riba. So it's a means to that riba, hence it's forbidden. So we have to do things like that. The moment we extend the remit, using hadith, we extend the remit of the Quranic ruling, we then have to think, well, what does that ruling mean then? Is it haram or not? Is the riba of hadith haram or not? So exactly the same discussions happen with parda. So I'm not saying hadith is not informative in these matters. It is very informative, because when I read through those books, I get a sense of what kind of questions are being posed to the Prophet in terms of the nature of riba. Okay, so again, it's a really important historical context. But the moment I start using it as law, then I'm getting into the discussions of halal, haram, allowed, not allowed. Okay, so I'm glad they've asked this question. And in a nutshell, my answer would be that if you use hadith to create new obligations, then you're creating problems. Okay, and I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, so the last question is that the reader who posted these questions, she comments on the qualification and authority required for people to discuss matters of jurisprudence, like difference between hadith and sunnah. So she says that if you choose to travel the road less traveled, so to say, then you should present evidence from people who are ideally certified as jurists. If not, they should at least know Arabic, know the tafsir of the Quran, and have authored at least one book of sound standing. So this is something that keeps coming up again and again, Sitabaji, that who are we to discuss matters of Islamic jurisprudence when we are not scholars, and who has the authority to discuss Islamic jurisprudence?
Yeah, the question of authority. So we were talking about this the other day, how Ziauddin Sardar in his book on reading the Quran in the contemporary, how he deals with the question of authority. It comes up again and again. And it's interesting that you asked me this question, because when I read this comment, I was also thinking, I'm not sure if the comment is about my credibility or not, or the credibility of the people writing on our forum. I think I have to take that back from kind of the personal and just engage with it very much as a researcher. So as a researcher, I tend to, and other researchers are like that, you tend to focus on the quality of the argument and the evidence, okay? Not the person saying it. And yes, sometimes that becomes important, especially if a person is very wedded to a particular political ideology. Yes, those things have to be taken into account. But generally, you look at the strength of the argument, the daleel. Okay, as Muslims, we stood on the daleel. So you look at the daleel, and you don't compare scholars' CVs. So this isn't a fight between scholars. Am I saying my scholar is better than your scholar, or your scholar, or the other person saying, no, my scholar is more qualified than your scholar? Okay, so we have to park those discussions. Now, the other thing is, how much knowledge does somebody need before they can say something? If you are a lay person, you're engaging with the Quran for your personal interest, you have the right to interpret the Quran, okay, with your limited knowledge. So if a woman is hit by her husband, she's not a scholar, she goes to the Quran, she finds the verse in Surah Nisa, she has the right to ask the question, is it the Quran that's sanctioning my husband to hit me? Okay, now that's the question for an ordinary Muslim. When scholars approach those questions, they do look at the wording of the Quran, the linguistics, the context of it. What is this talking about? Is it applicable to the general? Is it applicable to the specific? What does the Hadith literature tell us about the history of these, or the revelation of these verses, and all of that? Okay, so this is the reason why all of the works that I had cited in my presentation were robust and well evidenced works that either appear in really credible journals, or they come from scholars from a traditional background. Now, if the reader had quickly gone through the bibliography to the works that had been cited, they would have spotted names like Imam Malik. Imam Malik is one of the great Imams of Islam. He's written the Muwatta. And in the Muwatta, he says again and again, it is the Sunnah with us. It is the Sunnah Marufa with us. It is the practice with us. Okay, he says this all the time. He's as close to, he's met some of the companions of the Prophet. That's how close he is in the chronology of it. So, you might say Sayyid Sulaiman Nadwi is writing in 1929. So, he's more contemporary. But there's Imam Malik. The citations in there included Ibn Hisham, one of the earliest historians, Imam Abu Yusuf, okay, who was a Hanafi jurist and a Hanafi judge as well in a court of law. We've cited Maulana Maududi, we've cited Fazlur Rahman, we cited Amin Hassan Islahi, Javed Ahmed Khamdi, who are more contemporary scholars. All of these people have made very significant contributions to our understanding of Islam. And whilst I can't come up with my own arbitrary list of a scholar must meet these 10 things to be a scholar in my view, I do feel that the work that they've produced is of really high quality. Now, we may not agree with everything that they say, but the evidence that they bring and the arguments they bring are really robust arguments. So I think, in a way, this question is perhaps coming from an emotional place. The second thing that they've said here is about the road less traveled. Now, I don't know if they noticed the thing in brackets on the presentation. I'd said the road less traveled in our times. Now, the road is unfamiliar to us in our times because we have grown up at a time when text literalism, particularly Hadith literalism, is very dominant as a way of understanding Islam. Okay. Now, this is not the way of our tradition. If you look at the rich Islamic tradition, all of these debates that we're bringing up today are the questions that people have been raising for 1200 years, okay, for 1,000 years. So it's a road unfamiliar to us, but it's a road unfamiliar to us. It's a road less traveled for us, but it's not a road less traveled for the eminent scholars of Islam throughout the history of Islam. So I hope that makes it clear as to how I'd use that particular phrase.
I'll just ask an extension to this discussion. Many people might be wondering, why are we investing so much time in discussing something that is apparently a theoretical concept? Why is it important for ordinary Muslims like you and me to know the difference between Hadith and Sunnah? Mm-hmm. It might already be clear from some of the points that are examples that you have given, but just to wrap it up and clarify it.
Because it's actually not theoretical. The way this has been played out, I won't give lots of examples, but I'll give maybe 3. Okay. 1, sectarianism. Every group at this point, which is having these kind of casuistic, hair-splitting discussions on how they say namaz, and I fold my hands here, and I fold my hands here, and I do Rafa Yadan, and I don't Rafa Yadan, and we're fighting over it and arguing over it. And some groups would say the Prophet is alive in his grave and he listens because there's a hadith that says that those who are buried in the graves can listen to those who come to bury them. All of these discussions, these sectarian debates, are often couched in terms of hadith, and each sect tends to have its own favorite hadith to cite. Okay, so sectarianism. Now, the way we're approaching this, and the reason why we're saying that our scholars have always differentiated between hadith and sunnah, is that using that method makes it more ecumenical. In other words, if there is some variation in namaz, in our salat, because people living in, let's say, the Maghrib, the North African states, tend to leave their hands loose on the side, and people living in Pakistan fold their hands on the navel, both methods are okay, because that's not the core of namaz. The core of salat, the core of namaz is your ruku and your sujood. Okay, so your qiyam, your ruku, your sujood, your qada is namaz. As long as that's happening, that's namaz. Okay, that's salat. Now, if you approach the sunnah based, if you use the sunnah based approach, you step away from these fights and these really kind of minor points at which we become so divided and so divisive. That is the reason why, if you go to our Facebook group, I don't think we've ever engaged in any sectarian discussions, because there's no need to. Okay, so it makes you pull out from those small things and look at the bigger picture. The second example I will give is around the discourses on women. In particular, those who have a very patriarchal kind of misogynist bent tend to use and misuse hadith reports to curtail the rights of women. So discussions about the testimony of women, whether they can participate politically or not, whether they can travel independently or not, all of those things, what to wear, how to dress, all of those things are coming from hadith. Okay, and this is a long-standing problem, by the way. Even in the early days of Islam, our jurists were arguing that if a woman's testimony is worth half of a man's, and if she can't hear testimony, if she can't give testimony, she also can't hear testimony, therefore she can't be a judge in the court of law. And so you don't see Muslim women becoming judges in court of law. Okay, they're just not given the right. And we know, when we were reading Professor Muhammad Fadil's article about women being rulers or judges or not, he says that it's post-justificatory. In other words, you didn't allow women in, and then you said, here's a hadith that says you can't let them in. Or here's a hadith that says their intellect is inferior, or they can't hear, or they can't give testimony. And we also know that, scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah were questioning that. Ibn Taymiyyah was questioning, well, what do you mean by testimony? The Quranic verse about a woman's testimony about the matter of financial transactions. This is Al-Baqarah, by the way, Surah Al-Baqarah we're talking about, where the riba verses are. He says this isn't about a court of law. This is about a woman witnessing a contract, which is a financial transaction. So even scholars through time have picked out these flaws in reasoning. And so by using a sunnah-based approach, you make it quite clear what the core of religion is, and what matters are then open to further discussion and argument. But hadith tends to put everything in this kind of fossilized, calcified 7th century perspective. Okay, so discourses on women in particular, and then discourses about minorities as well. So who do you impose jizya on? Do you still, if you live in a multicultural country, you've got Hindus and you've got Muslims, you've got Christians living there, would we be imposing jizya? So people who would make a hadith-based argument will say, yes, you will. And people who don't follow that will say, well, actually, no, because jizya was specific to the time of Risalat, when Prophet Muhammad was there as a Rasul. And in Surah Tawbah, Allah says, these people, these groups are your enemies, you will subjugate them. And the Ahlul Kitab, the people of the book, you will impose a jizya on them. Okay, so these are really crucial points. So what I'm talking here, Fariha, is about things like democracy and citizenship. I'm talking about rights of half of the Muslim population. Okay, I'm talking about the divisiveness, the sectarianism, which leads to actual harm, which leads to people killing each other because of their sectarian viewpoints. So this is not just a theoretical small debate. It is a debate with vast implications, and it's important that, well, all we can do is try to explain it to people. You can't convince people. All we can do is to try to explain to them and put this information in front of them. So no, I would say it's not theoretical at all. We have to think about where law comes from. We have to think about where deen comes from. So if we're able to think clearly about it, we're then able to engage with kind of the debates around the application of law, right? The development of law, the application of law. And as I said, these are not new. Our scholars have been talking about these things for centuries. It feels new to us in our times.
Thank you so much, Sitabaji. This was very elaborate. I hope it was useful for the readers. If our readers or our listeners have any further questions, they can for sure put those down, and we can discuss those in a later video. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fariha. Yeah, I think this has been a great discussion as well. It's also helped me clarify some of my concepts as well as I've gone back over the discussion and the questions. So I think it's been a great learning experience, and certainly refreshed my learning as well in these matters. So I do hope that our listeners have found this useful.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Fariha, for your time as well, and for putting all that effort in and for collating all the questions for us. And inshallah, we'll carry on with our kind of, I think I like our video format. Perhaps it does allow for a bit more interactivity from everybody. So let's continue with that in future as well. So Jazakallah for your time.
Thank you so much.
Okay, you're most welcome. Assalamu alaikum.